The red dust of planet Kythera swirled around Captain Gina's boots as she walked through the ancient ruins. Her scanner beeped softly in her hand, showing strange energy readings from the crystalline structures that rose like frozen lightning from the ground. The crystals were beautiful but alien, their surfaces catching the pale light of the distant sun and throwing it back in colors that had no names. Beside her, Bahram sniffed the air carefully. The large dog was not like the pets people kept on Earth. His black fur was streaked with silver lines where cybernetic implants ran beneath his skin. His eyes glowed with a soft blue light when he used his enhanced senses. Bahram had been bred and modified for deep space exploration, his loyalty as strong as his enhanced abilities. He was Gina's partner, not just her pet. "Captain, I'm getting some weird readings over here," called Do-hyun from near a cluster of tall crystals. The young communications officer held his scanner up high, trying to get a better signal. His face was worried as he watched the numbers jump around on his screen. Nari knelt beside a broken pillar, her scientific tools spread around her on the dusty ground. The xenobiologist was carefully taking samples of the strange material that made up the ruins. "These structures are old," she said without looking up. "Maybe thousands of years old. But the crystals seem to be responding to something. They're getting warmer." Gina nodded and looked around the ruins. Their ship was parked 2 kilometers away, hidden behind a ridge of black rock. They had been exploring Kythera for 3 days now, mapping the ruins and taking samples. The planet seemed empty of life, just dust and wind and these mysterious structures left by some long-dead civilization. Bahram suddenly stopped sniffing and raised his head. His ears went forward and his body became very still. A low growl came from deep in his chest. Gina had learned to trust the dog's enhanced senses completely. If Bahram sensed danger, then danger was coming. "Everyone stay alert," Gina said quietly into her comm unit. "Bahram's picking up something." The attack came without warning. A massive shape dropped from the sky, landing hard on the ground between the scattered crystals. Dust exploded in all directions as the creature stood up to its full height. It was huge, nearly 3 meters tall with rough green scales and burning yellow eyes. Its arms were long and powerful, ending in claws that looked like they could tear through metal. A weapon was strapped to its back, some kind of plasma rifle that hummed with deadly energy. "Humans," the creature said in perfect standard speech, its voice deep and mocking. "I should have known. Like insects, you crawl into every dark corner of the galaxy." Gina raised her own weapon but knew it was almost useless against something that size. "We're peaceful explorers," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're not here to cause trouble." The alien threw back its head and laughed. The sound was harsh and cruel. "Peaceful? You are scavengers, nothing more. You take what does not belong to you and call it science." It unstrapped the plasma rifle from its back with one smooth motion. "I am HFY of the Solareth Empire. I hunt the weak and worthless across the stars, and humans are the most worthless of all." Do-hyun was backing away slowly, his hands shaking as he tried to work his comm unit. "Captain, I can't reach the ship. Something's jamming our signals." Nari had dropped her tools and was reaching for her sidearm, but her movements were slow with fear. The alien was too big, too fast, too dangerous for their small team to handle. HFY raised his plasma rifle and pointed it at Gina. "Your species disgusts me. You form attachments to animals like they are your equals. You waste your emotions on creatures that exist only to serve." His yellow eyes looked down at Bahram with contempt. "Even now you keep this beast close to you like it matters." "He's not a beast," Gina said, anger making her brave. "He's my partner." The alien's laughter was even crueler this time. "Partner? It is an animal with some crude metal pushed into its skull. Watch how quickly your partner abandons you when real danger comes." HFY fired his weapon, but not at Gina. The plasma bolt was aimed at the ground near Bahram's feet, meant to scare the dog away. But Bahram did not run. Instead, he launched himself forward with all the power in his enhanced muscles. The dog's leap was perfect, carrying him through the air toward the alien's throat. But HFY was a skilled hunter. He spun aside at the last second and brought the butt of his rifle around in a crushing blow. The weapon struck Barum in the side with a sickening crack. Barum hit the ground hard and rolled several times before coming to rest against one of the crystal formations. He tried to stand, but his back legs would not work properly. Blue sparks flickered from the cybernetic implants along his spine. His enhanced systems were failing. "No!" Gina screamed and started to run toward her injured companion. HFY grabbed her by the arm and lifted her off the ground like she weighed nothing. "See how easily your precious bond breaks? The animal is dying and there is nothing you can do about it." Barum was whimpering now, trying to drag himself toward Gina with his front legs. His blue eyes were dim and flickering. Blood was spreading in the dust beneath him. The cybernetic lines under his fur were sparking and going dark one by one. "Please," Gina begged, tears running down her face. "Don't hurt him anymore. Take me if you want, but leave him alone." HFY dropped her to the ground and walked slowly toward the wounded dog. "This is what I hate most about your species. You cry over animals like they are children. It makes you weak." He raised his rifle again, this time pointing it directly at Barum's head. "I will put this creature out of its misery, and then I will put you out of yours." But as the alien prepared to fire, something strange began to happen. The crystals around them started to glow brighter, responding to some unseen force. The air itself seemed to vibrate with hidden energy. The crystals around them began to sing. It was not a sound that anyone could hear with their ears. Instead, it was something deeper, something that seemed to come from inside their bones. The tall crystal formations that had stood silent for thousands of years now pulsed with warm light. The light started deep blue, then shifted to purple, then to colors that had no names. HFY stopped with his finger on the trigger of his plasma rifle. His yellow eyes went wide as he looked around at the glowing crystals. "What is this?" he growled, but his voice was no longer as confident as before. Gina felt it too. A strange tingling started in her fingertips and spread up her arms. The air around them felt thick and electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. She looked at Barum and her heart almost stopped. The wounded dog was changing. The blue sparks from his damaged cybernetic implants were not dying out. Instead, they were growing brighter. The sparks reached out from his body like tiny fingers of light, touching the crystal formation he lay against. Where the sparks met the crystal, new patterns of light began to flow. "Barum," Gina whispered. The dog's eyes opened fully, and they were no longer just glowing blue. Now they held depths of light that seemed to go on forever. He tried to stand, again, and this time his back legs worked. But it was more than that. He moved with a grace and power that was beyond anything his enhanced muscles should have been able to do. HFY took a step backward, his weapon now pointing at the crystal formations instead of at the dog. "This is not possible. These ruins have been dead for millennia." But the ruins were not dead anymore. Deep beneath the ground, something vast was waking up. Machines that had been sleeping since before any of their species had learned to make fire were beginning to turn. The crystal formations were not just decorations or monuments. They were part of something much larger, much more complex. Do-hyun's scanner was going crazy in his hands. Numbers flashed across the screen too fast to read. "Captain," he called out, his voice shaking with excitement and fear. "The energy readings are off the charts. Something huge is powering up under us." Nari had backed away from the crystal she had been studying, but she could not take her eyes off it. The ancient material was flowing like liquid now, reshaping itself as they watched. "These aren't ruins," she said in wonder. "They're some kind of technology, living technology." The tingling in Gina's body was getting stronger. She could feel something reaching out to her, something vast and ancient and incredibly intelligent. It was not hostile, but it was so alien that her mind could barely understand it. And somehow it was connected to Barum. The dog walked toward her on steady legs. His wounds were healing as she watched, but it was not just his body that was changing. There was something different in his eyes, something that had not been there before. He was still Barum, still her loyal companion, but he was also becoming something more. The bond she whispered, and somehow she knew it was true. It's reading, the bond between us. HFY heard her words and snarled, Impossible. You are talking nonsense. Animals cannot form true bonds with other species. But even as he spoke, the alien was beginning to feel the change himself. The strange energy that flowed from the crystals was touching him too. He could feel it trying to get inside his mind, trying to understand what he was, and what it found there made the ancient intelligence pause with something like surprise. The Solareth hunter was not like the humans. His mind was built for violence and conquest. He lived for the hunt, for the moment when he stood over defeated prey. But buried deep inside that killer's instinct was something else, something that his people had forgotten long ago. The crystals pulsed brighter, and HFY felt his own body beginning to change. But unlike the gentle transformation happening to Gina and Bahram, his change was violent and painful. His scales began to shift and flow. His claws became longer and sharper. His already powerful muscles grew even stronger. No, he roared, fighting against the change. I will not be controlled by dead machines. But the machines were not trying to control him. They were trying to understand him. And in understanding him, they were changing him into something that matched what they found in his deepest thoughts. Bahram walked up to Gina and pressed his head against her hand. The moment they touched, the world exploded with light and sensation. Gina could suddenly see through Bahram's enhanced senses. She could smell things that had no scent, hear sounds that made no noise, feel the movement of energy through the crystal network that stretched for miles beneath the planet's surface. And through it all, she could sense the presence that was waking up. It was old beyond imagination, older than their solar system, older than some of the stars in the sky. It had been waiting here for so long that it had almost forgotten why it was waiting. But now it remembered. It was waiting for someone who could bridge the gap between species, someone who could show that different forms of life could work together instead of destroying each other. And in the bond between Gina and Bahram, it had found what it was looking for. The presence reached out further, touching Do-hyun and Nari with gentle fingers of energy. They were not ready for the full transformation, but they could be prepared. They could be witnesses to what was about to happen. HFY tried to run, but his feet would not obey him. The energy had wrapped around him like invisible chains. He could feel his mind being examined, his memories being read, his very soul being weighed and measured, and what the ancient intelligence found there was not what he expected. Deep inside the killer, buried under generations of violence and hatred, was the memory of what the Solareth had once been. They had not always been hunters and conquerors. Long ago they had been something else, something better. The crystals sang louder now, their song filling the air with harmonies that no living throat could make. The ground beneath their feet began to warm as the ancient machines far below came fully online for the first time in thousands of years. Bahram looked up at Gina with eyes that held the wisdom of ages, and she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The world changed around them in ways that words could not describe. Gina felt herself lifting off the ground, but she was not flying. Instead, she was becoming part of something larger. The crystal network beneath the planet was reaching up through her feet, through her hands where she touched Bahram, connecting her to a web of intelligence that stretched across the entire world. Through this connection, she could see everything, every grain of dust on the planet's surface, every drop of water hidden deep in underground rivers, every piece of ancient machinery that had waited in silence for this moment. The planet was not dead. It had been sleeping, and now it was waking, up because of her bond with Bahram. The dog stood beside her, no longer just an animal with cybernetic implants. His consciousness had expanded beyond anything that should have been possible. He could think thoughts that were too complex for his original brain, understand concepts that would have been meaningless to him before. But he was still Bahram. He was still loyal, still protective, still devoted to Gina above all else. That devotion was what the ancient intelligence found most interesting. The presence that lived in the crystal network had been created by a race that had died out millions, of years ago. These beings had been called the Ancients, though they had many names across the galaxy. They had been the first to travel between the stars, the first to seed life on empty worlds, the first to ask the great questions about the meaning of existence. Before they had faded away into legend, the Ancients had left tests scattered across the galaxy. These tests were designed to find species that were ready to take the next step in their evolution. Not evolution of the body, but evolution of the mind and spirit. Most species failed the test. They were too selfish, too violent, too focused on their own survival to understand what the Ancients were offering. But sometimes, very rarely, a species would show something special. They would show the ability to form bonds that went beyond their own kind. Gina and Bahram had shown that ability. The transformation was not painful for them. Instead, it felt like coming home after a long journey. Gina's consciousness expanded to match the network, allowing her to think with the processing power of an entire world. But she did not lose herself in that vastness. Her love for Bahram, her responsibility for her crew, her human emotions and memories kept her anchored to who she was. Bahram's transformation was different but equally profound. His enhanced senses became something beyond physical perception. He could feel the emotions of every living thing for miles around. He could sense the flow of energy through the crystal network like a bloodhound following a scent. And through it all, his bond with Gina grew stronger and more complex. HFY was not so fortunate. The alien hunter fought against the transformation with every bit of his considerable strength. His body writhed and changed as the ancient intelligence tried to understand what he was. His scales became harder, like armor. His claws grew longer and sharper. His muscles swelled with power that could tear apart starship hulls. But the changes were not just physical. The Ancient's test was examining his mind, his spirit, his deepest thoughts and desires. And what they found there was troubling. HFY had spent his entire life believing that strength came from conquest. He had been taught that the weak existed only to serve the strong, that mercy was a weakness, that bonds between different species were impossible. His whole culture was built on these ideas, but buried deep in his genetic memory were older truths. The Solarith had not always been hunters and killers. Long ago, before they had learned to travel between stars, they had been different. They had formed pack bonds not just with their own kind, but with other species on their home world. They had been protectors, not destroyers. The ancient intelligence found these buried memories and began to bring them to the surface. This was why HFY's transformation was so violent and painful. He was not just changing his body. He was being forced to remember what his people had once been and to confront what they had become. Do-hyun and Nari watched in amazement and terror as their captain and her dog became something beyond human understanding. They could feel the edges of the transformation touching their own minds, but they were not ready for the full change. The ancient intelligence was preparing them slowly, gently, showing them glimpses of what was possible. "Captain?" Do-hyun whispered, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you still you?" Gina turned to look at him, and her eyes now held depths that seemed to contain entire galaxies. But when she spoke, her voice was still warm and familiar. "I'm still me, Do-hyun. I'm just more than I was before." She could see the fear in his eyes and felt compassion for him. The transformation was overwhelming to watch from the outside, but she could also see the potential in him, the capacity for growth that the ancient intelligence had recognized. He would be ready soon. Nari was kneeling beside one of the crystal formations, her scientific mind trying to understand what was happening. The xenobiologist in her was fascinated by the changes she was witnessing, but the human in her was terrified. "This is impossible," she kept saying. "Consciousness doesn't work this way. Evolution doesn't work this way." "Evolution is not just about survival," Gina said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the crystals themselves. "It's about becoming something better than what you were." Through the crystal network, she could feel other worlds waking up. The signal that had activated Cathara was spreading across the galaxy, reaching other ancient test sites that had been dormant for millennia. On dozens of worlds, other species were about to face the same choice that she and HFY were facing now. Some would pass the test, others would fail. But for the first time in millions of years, the galaxy was about to see the birth of new gods. HFY finally stopped fighting the transformation. His body settled into its new shape, more powerful than before, but also somehow more graceful. His yellow eyes now held flecks of the same deep light that shone in Gina's and Bahram's eyes, but unlike them, he looked confused and lost. "What have you done to me?" he asked, his voice no longer harsh and mocking, but filled with genuine uncertainty. "We have shown you what you could be," Gina replied. "What your people could have been, if they had chosen a different path." The ancient intelligence that flowed through all of them pulsed with something like satisfaction. The test was almost complete. 3 very different beings had been transformed, each in their own way. Now came the most important part. Now they had to choose what to do with their new power. The 3 transformed beings stood in silence as the truth of their situation became clear. Gina could see it all now through the crystal network that connected her mind to the ancient intelligence. Across the galaxy, on hundreds of different worlds, similar awakening sites were coming to life. Some had been buried under ice for millions of years. Others had been hidden in the hearts of gas giant moons or floating in the dark spaces between stars. All of them had been waiting for this moment. The ancients had not just left one test. They had created an entire network of trials, each one designed to find species that could evolve beyond their basic nature. Most species never found the test sites. Those that did usually failed, destroyed by their own selfishness and violence. But occasionally, very rarely, a species would pass. When they did, they became something more than they had been before. "We are the first in 10,000 years, Gina said, her voice carrying the weight of that knowledge. "The last species to pass the test was so long ago that even the ancients' records have forgotten their name." Bahram padded closer to her, his enhanced form moving with impossible grace. Through their bond, she could feel his thoughts. No longer the simple desires of an animal, but complex ideas about duty and protection and love. He understood what they had become, but he also understood what they still were. They were partners, bonded across the gap between species by something stronger than evolution itself. HFY was struggling with his new awareness. For his entire life, he had believed that power meant taking what you wanted from those weaker than yourself. But now he could feel the thoughts and emotions of every living thing around him. He could sense Do-hyun's fear, Nari's wonder, and most disturbing of all, he could feel Gina's compassion. She felt sorry for him. After everything he had done, after he had tried to kill her and her companion, she still looked at him with pity rather than hatred. The concept was so alien to his old way of thinking that it made his head spin. "I do not understand," he said, his powerful hands clenching and unclenching as he fought with ideas that had no place in his warrior culture. "You should hate me. I am your enemy. I tried to destroy what you love." "You were afraid," Gina replied simply. "Your whole culture is built on fear. Fear of being weak, fear of being conquered, fear of forming bonds that might make you vulnerable. But fear is not strength. Love is strength." Through the network, she showed him what she meant. She let him feel the bond between herself and Bahram, not just the surface loyalty, but the deep connection that had allowed them to transcend their individual limitations. She showed him how that bond had made them both stronger, not weaker. For the first time in his life, HFY understood what he had been missing. The crystal formations around them pulsed with new patterns of light as information flowed through the network. The ancient intelligence was showing them their new purpose, their role in the cosmic plan that the ancients had set in motion so long ago. They were to be gardeners, not gardeners of plants or crops, but gardeners of consciousness itself. Their job was to help other species take the next step in their evolution, to guide them away from the paths of destruction and toward something better. They would be teachers, protectors, and examples of what different forms of life could achieve when they worked together. "The galaxy is full of young species," the ancient voice spoke through the crystals, its words forming directly in their minds rather than in their ears. "Most will destroy themselves before they learn wisdom. But some can be saved if they have the right guidance. Do-hyun took a shaky step forward, his scanner forgotten in his hands. Captain, what does this mean for us? For humanity? Gina turned to look at her communications officer, seeing him now not just as a member of her crew, but as a representative of an entire species that was still learning, still growing. Humanity had potential, but they also had the same capacity for violence and selfishness that had destroyed so many other races. It means we have a choice to make, she said. We can use what we've become to help our people grow, or we can watch them make the same mistakes that countless others have made. Nari was still studying the crystal formations, but now she was seeing them with new understanding. These sites aren't just tests, she said with growing excitement. They're schools. Each one is designed to teach different lessons about cooperation and evolution. The ancient intelligence confirmed her guess. Each test site across the galaxy was unique, designed to challenge species in different ways. Some tested their ability to work with other races. Others tested their willingness to sacrifice for future generations. Still others challenged their capacity for forgiveness and redemption. But all of them had the same goal: to create beings who could guide the galaxy toward a better future. HFY was beginning to understand his own role in this cosmic plan. His transformation had been painful because he represented something important: the possibility of redemption. Even the most violent and selfish beings could change if they were willing to confront their true nature. My people, he said slowly, his voice heavy with new emotion. The Solarith Empire, they are still out there, still hunting, still destroying. What happens to them? That depends on you, Gina replied. You know them better than we do. You understand their culture, their fears, their potential for growth. If anyone can reach them, it would be someone who was once like them. The idea terrified him. How could he, who had been the perfect example of everything wrong with his people, possibly teach them to be better? But even as the fear rose in his chest, he felt something else: hope. For the first time in his life, he could imagine a future where strength came from protection rather than conquest. Through the network, they could sense other newly awakened beings across the galaxy. On a water world in the Andromeda Spiral, an aquatic species had learned to merge their consciousness with their planet's ocean currents. In a binary star system near the galactic core, crystalline beings had transcended their individual forms to become a collective intelligence that spanned multiple worlds. All of them were facing the same realization. They had been chosen to shepherd the galaxy into a new age of cooperation and growth. But with that honor came tremendous responsibility. The test is not over, the ancient voice warned them. Becoming more than you were is only the beginning. Now you must prove that you can. Use your power wisely. The first test of their new power came sooner than expected. 3 days after their transformation, Do-hyun's communication equipment picked up incoming signals. A fleet of Solarith warships was approaching Kithara, drawn by the energy signature that had spread across the galaxy when the ancient network awakened. They were coming to investigate what had happened to HFY. 12 ships, Do-hyun reported, his voice tight with worry. Heavy cruisers, all of them. They'll be here in 6 hours. Nari looked up from her study of the crystal formations. Can we hide? Make them think nothing happened here? Gina shook her head. The crystal network was still active, still singing its ancient song across space. There was no way to conceal what Kithara had become, and even if there was, she was not. Sure, she wanted to hide. The Solarith fleet represented exactly the kind of challenge that she and her companions had been transformed to meet. HFY stood at the edge of the ruins, staring up at the sky where his former people would soon appear. His new form was magnificent and terrible, still clearly Solarith but changed in ways that spoke of power beyond imagination. His scales now held patterns of light that shifted like living constellations. His eyes burned with the same deep fire that lived in the crystals around them. They will not listen to words, he said quietly. The Solarith understand only strength. If I try to tell them what I have learned, they will think I have been enslaved by alien technology. Then we show them. Gina replied. Through her bond with Baram, she could feel the dog's agreement. They had not been given these new abilities to hide from conflict. They had been transformed to face it and, if possible, transform it into something better. When the Solareth fleet arrived, they found Kythera blazing with light. The crystal formations now towered hundreds of meters into the sky, their surfaces alive with patterns that hurt to look at directly. The planet itself seemed to pulse. With barely contained energy, the lead ship landed first, disgorging a squad of elite Solareth hunters. They were smaller than Vexhai, but just as deadly, their weapons and armor representing the best that their military technology could produce. Their leader was a female named Kasara, her red scales marked with the battle scars that showed her high rank. Vexhai of the Deep Hunt, she called out in the traditional challenge greeting. You have missed 3 scheduled reports. Explain yourself, or face judgment for dereliction of duty. Vexhai stepped forward to meet her, and Kasara took an involuntary step backward. Even to another Solareth, the change in him was overwhelming. He radiated power that made their advanced weapons seem like primitive clubs. I have found something greater than duty, he replied, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the crystal formations around them. I have found truth, Kasara snarled and raised her plasma rifle. You have been contaminated by alien influence. The Empire will cleanse you of this weakness. She fired, but the plasma bolt simply dissolved when it reached Vexhai. He had not moved to defend himself or activated any kind of shield. The deadly energy just ceased to exist when it touched his transformed form. Violence will not work here, he said sadly. Not anymore. The other Solareth hunters opened fire as well, their weapons creating a storm of destruction that should have turned everything in the area to ash, but none of it reached its targets. Gina and Baram stood calmly in the center of the barrage, the energy weapons simply failing to function in their presence. Impossible, Kasara breathed. Not impossible, Gina said, stepping forward. Just different. Your weapons are designed to destroy, but we have moved beyond destruction. She reached out with her transformed consciousness, touching the minds of the Solareth soldiers. What she found there was exactly what she had expected. Fear disguised as aggression, loneliness disguised as strength, and buried deep beneath it all, the same capacity for growth that existed in every intelligent species. One by one, the Solareth hunters stopped firing. Not because their weapons had been taken away, but because they no longer wanted to use them. Through Gina's gentle touch, they were beginning to feel what Vexhai had felt during his transformation, the possibility of being something more than they were. Kasara was the last to lower her weapon. What are you? She whispered. We are what you could become, Vexhai answered. What all of us could become if we chose cooperation over conquest. The transformation of the Solareth hunting party was not as dramatic as what had happened to Vexhai. The ancient network was more subtle now, more careful. Instead of forcing change, it offered choice. Each of the hunters could feel the possibility of growth, of moving beyond their culture's obsession with violence and domination. Some of them accepted. Others did not, and they were allowed to leave unchanged, returning to their ships with memories that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But enough accepted that when the Solareth fleet left Kythera, they carried with them the seeds of a revolution that would reshape their entire empire. Word of what had happened spread quickly across the galaxy. Some species reacted with fear, seeing the transformed beings as a threat to be destroyed. Others reacted with hope, recognizing them as the teachers and guides they had been waiting for. Wars that had raged for centuries suddenly ended as the combatants realized they were fighting over things that no longer mattered. Trade routes that had been closed by mutual distrust reopened as former enemies began to see each other as potential partners. It was not a perfect transformation. Many species were too set in their ways to change. Some actively fought against the new order, preferring familiar hatreds to unfamiliar hopes. But for the first time in galactic history, there was a real possibility of lasting peace. Gina, Baram, and Vexhai became the first of what historians would later call the bridge builders. They traveled from world to world, not as conquerors, but as teachers showing other species what was possible when different forms of life learned to work together. Do-hyun and Nari eventually underwent their own transformations, becoming part of a growing network of evolved beings who served as links between the transcended and those still growing toward transcendence. The ancient intelligence that had slept in Kythera's crystals finally found the rest it had been seeking for millions of years. Its purpose was fulfilled. The galaxy now had guardians who would guide it toward a better future, and at the center of it all was a simple truth that the ancients had discovered long ago. Love was indeed stronger than fear, bonds were more powerful than weapons, and the greatest strength came not from standing alone, but from choosing to stand together. The alien had laughed at her wounded dog, but that laughter had awakened something that would change the galaxy forever.